When Star Wars first came out in 1978, I was 7 years old. I was captivated, like many other young people and older people at that time. When the VCRs came out in the 1980s, I proudly watched the original version 13 times. Psychologists have studied the effect that movies and TV programs have on viewers, and the findings are interesting. It shows that when we are watching a show or a movie, we tend to identify with characters and empathize with their plight. The reason I like the Star Wars analogy is because of the diversity of the characters and the leadership traits that they each possess. George Lucas was very intentional in how he created such a mismatch of different types of characters and leaders within the galaxy. And these different characters help us frame a discussion around ethical leadership. Think of our moral compass along the same lines as Lucas designed the Force in the Star Wars series. Just as in Star Wars, there is a dark side and a light side to the Force. The dark side is very powerful and must be approached with caution. Let's explore the different leadership traits of the characters. First, we have the notorious villain, Darth Vader, or Lord Vader, a very powerful commander who uses order, fear, discipline to achieve his conquest objectives. His generals cower in fear, if you recall. His army is stormtroopers aligned in perfect lines and look and think alike. The dark side of the Force can also pull others in who may find themselves susceptible from time to time. Not everyone is born evil, and sometimes we are unexpectedly sucked in, as Lord Vader once was. We learned in the Star Wars prequels that came after the original Star Wars series that young Anakin Skywalker grew up with a good mother and trained under the wise and watchful mentorship of Yoda. Throughout our lives, the dark side pulls at us. It gnaws at our insecurities. Sometimes out of sheer boredom, sometimes out of misguided belief or poorly held assumptions, sometimes just out of inattention, that dark side pulls us over. Rationalization of our misbehaviors is a mental gymnastic performed by our brains that justifies our actions. We may rationalize unethical behavior on moral or even religious beliefs. We may distort the consequences of our actions or disregard them altogether when we don't see or feel the direct results of our actions. It's a toxic combination when the dark leaders find a group of susceptible followers, and this is created through a conducive environment. What ensues can exemplify the worst of human interactions: genocides, discriminations, tortures, abuses of power. For Jen and I, the most interesting takeaway from labeling Vader-type leaders is to recognize that in most cases, they weren't always this way. And perhaps the same way as Vader found redemption in Return of the Jedi, perhaps these leaders too can find their way back to the light side of the Force. Darth Sidious, or the Emperor, was the evilest of all the characters in the Star Wars series. He was evil to the core, yet very powerful because he was a master in using the dark side of the Force to get what he wanted. While seemingly principled in his adherence to his doctrine, his misguided doctrine had but one objective: to give him the ultimate power and control of the entire universe, and be damned to all those living under him. For most of us, we might wonder or ask ourselves, why would anyone want that much power? And immediately feel the loneliness that would accompany such absolute power. But that still does not dissuade characters through history and present day from pursuing such incredibly over-the-top intentions. The dark side of the Force is inhabited by the characters that suffer what sometimes experts characterize as the dark triad of personality disorders. We talked about these in the main part of the course. We talked about narcissism, which is a neurological trait that leads one towards that dark side of the Force. The excessive interest and admiration of self. The characteristics are like conceit, self-love, self-admiration, self-regard, self-absorption, self-obsession, self-centeredness, egoism. The second one below that is Machiavellianism. And these are the kind of snake oil salespeople that are out there. They're devious, they're crafty, they're wily, they're sly, they're scheming, they're conniving. The third shadow of the dark triad is psychopathy, which is to lead with complete lack of conscience. A psychopathic leader is someone who is demented, unsound, unstable, deranged, and possibly insane. Recall the callousness, the insensitivity we witnessed as the Emperor and Vader by his side used the Death Star to blow up the planet Alderaan. It momentarily gave them a jolt of absolute power, but it didn't last. It was almost gone as fast as it arrived. It may seem like leaders with such characteristics would be hideous and obvious as Darth Sidious' appearance was in Star Wars. But in the real world, so rarely do these types of leaders appear as their evil inner selves. In fact, a leader may be a narcissist, a Machiavellian, or a psychopath and still be very charming and persuasive. They can be highly focused on fulfilling seemingly worthy missions. For instance, as we saw in the course, to make Russia a superpower, or perhaps to build a blood diagnostic machine that can detect 200 different types of diseases. And these types of leaders can be highly adept at identifying willing followers and forcing them, perhaps unwillingly or willingly, to help them in these bold pursuits. These are the scariest of all leaders because they recognize that there are people out there, followers, that they can lure and force to follow their orders. Evil is the lowest and most destructive incarnation of the dark side, and that it inflicts pain and suffering, often and ultimately ending in death. There are plenty of real examples of leaders in history who embodied Darth Sidious's brand of leadership. Hitler, Osama bin Laden, Kim Jong-un. Let's move on and talk about Leia-type leadership. I salute the light and the force within you and without you, the light that shines away from the dark side. Whatever it is the force wills, I will. I will, its will. Its will, not mine, will be done. Give me the knowledge of the all-knowing force. Give me the power to carry out the will of the force. May the force be with us all. Carrie Fisher in her book, The Princess Diarist. The opposite of Lord Vader type leadership and Darth Sidious type leadership skills is Princess Leia type leaders. Leia's style of leadership was inclusive. Just look at the hodgepodge of different types of followers who made up the Rebel Alliance. Ethnic diversity, open collaboration epitomized the rebel officer ranks. There were no lines of soldiers. Instead, there was a scattering of followers full of their own ideas and ambitions, but all completely aligned around the objective of overthrowing the empire. When someone had what they believed was a good idea, Leia allowed them the freedom to act on their own initiative. Leia-type leaders know they can't do it on their own. They embody a sense of humility, which is reflected in an openness to accept help and new ideas. Humility is knowing your own limits. When described and understood and explained in this way, leaders with true humility learn more because they recognize that there are others out there that know more than they do. As a result, they give themselves permission to ask the innocent, sometimes seemingly stupid, childlike questions. Leia-type leaders embody other types of ethical leadership virtues, including things like moral courage, which was one of our principles in our course, an emotional strength to exercise will to face opposition no matter the cost, justice, which manifests itself in a sense of obligation to public good and the fair and the equal treatment of others, temperance, which is to say to avoid traps of excesses and to control one's self-interest and desires. How about transcendence? the ability of an ethical leader to rise above individual circumstance and to forge a connection with the collective and to give meaning to the world. This doesn't mean that they don't make tough decisions. Instead, they weigh these decisions with longer-term objectives in mind, sometimes able to step back when necessary to achieve 2 steps forward in the future. How about this characteristic of integrity, which we talked about in the course, often associated with ethical leaders, but not easily articulated? Integrity is kind of oneness of self. It's being true to yourself, your values, your commitments, and being that same human being no matter what the circumstance, at work, at leisure, at home. Compassion, which embodies kindness, caring, concern, generosity, and love for others. This orientation puts others ahead of ourselves. And finally, the characteristics of resilience and grit, which speaks to a leader's ability to pursue long-term objectives through thick and thin with passion and perseverance. Leia-type leaders think big picture. They weigh the costs and the benefits. They recognize that sometimes you have to lose one day to fight and possibly win another. Ethical philosophers call this the Utilitarianism perspective. People who adopt a utilitarian ethical perspective tend to act and make decisions that do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The decisions we make on Earth may not carry the same weight as intergalactic peace, but that doesn't make the decisions any easier. Some of us find ourselves having to deal with issues of layoffs and downsizing. Utilitarian leaders make those sorts of ethical judgments all the time in making these decisions. Another characteristic of Leia-type leaders is an emphasis on justice and fairness. They tend to possess an underlying belief that everyone is equal and that the rights of all individuals rank the same. And notice how she was able to stand up and confront Lord Vader so directly. These Leia-type leadership characteristics are so rarely found in the real world today, but they serve as an ideal towards which we can all aspire. Some real-life examples in modern day would include Nelson Mandela, Mother Teresa, Gandhi, Bill and Melinda Gates, Warren Buffett, and Michael Jordan. So they do exist if we are looking for them. Luke Skywalker was arguably the hero in Star Wars. We watched him grow from innocence and ignorance of the mighty rebellion underway across the universe to many, many years later, the Savior. However, Luke's leadership style varied greatly from that of his sister Leia. Under Yoda's tutelage, Luke learned the ways of the Jedi Knight and learned the ways of the Force, ever wary of the power of the dark side of the Force. In our analogy, Yoda warned him and trained him as best he could to resist those dark temptations that his father felt susceptible to. Luke's adherence to the Jedi Code made him the straight arrow. Kant was an ethical philosopher, and his contribution to ethical philosophy was Kant's categorical imperative. This is an ethical perspective that one may adopt when you're living by a strong set of principles or a moral code, as the way that Jedi Knights did in Star Wars. Their imperative was to do what was right, no matter what the cost, personal or otherwise, including a willingness to lose their own lives. On the dark side, we see such radical religious leaders and followers that start wars and engage in suicidal terrorist attacks in the name of whatever divine power they believe to be righteous. On the lighter side of the ethics, we see soldiers who defend their countries. We see doctors and nurses who walk into battlefields and pandemics, risking their own lives to save others. We see humanitarians who rise to the occasion when disasters strike, be it a flood, tornado, hurricane, famine, or any other number of catastrophes, to lend a hand, raise money, contribute know-how, or other resources. At the end of Star Wars, in the heat of the battle, someone had to fly into the middle of the Death Star to lob 2 proton torpedoes into the thermal exhaust port of the Death Star to blow it up. There was only the smallest sliver of chance that once Luke and R2-D2 entered into the thermal ducts of the Death Star, they would ever emerge alive. But Luke didn't hesitate because he knew it was the right thing to do. Luke-type leaders are altruistic in that sense. Altruism is an ethical perspective that puts others first no matter the personal cost. This concern for others overrides their concern for self and characterizes Luke-type leaders. And finally, we have Solo-type leaders. Han Solo, played by Harrison Ford, was by many measures the most popular character in the Star Wars series. After all, what's not to like? He had swagger, he had charm, he was outspoken, he was himself unapologetic for his own shortcomings. And in this way, you can at least admit that he was authentic. He, Harrison Ford, wasn't a bad human. He was much more on the good side of the bad-good human graph. He was bad and good. Like most people, a good person who does bad things or a bad person who does good things. As long as people are involved, people will do bad or good things to them, especially when there's money and small dogs involved. Carrie Fisher, once again from The Princess Diarist. What made Han Solo relatable to so many of the viewers was that he was also flawed. He was an outlaw. He was, in many respects, a bandit. He was scrappy, he was compulsive, he was argumentative, and most of all, he couldn't help but be self-centered and unable to let go of his own ego. He was motivated, as many of us are, by that sense of what is in it for me. And so in this sense, Han Solo represents individualism as well. Underneath the cowboy exterior, we felt at times his inner conflict between doing what's right and looking out for number one. This was a character who would readily admit that they had not spent a single moment of their life considering the ethics of their actions and decisions. Is Han Solo an outlier or the norm of today's society? I think many of us in the world today think, act, and behave a lot like Han Solo. At our core, we are generally good people, but depending on the situation, we can be swayed to make poor decisions or poor choices because our instinct is almost first and foremost self-interest. Morality for Han Solo is a balancing act, and as long as I'm offsetting my immoral actions with moral ones, then I can live with myself. Ethical philosopher called this balancing moral cleansing. Moral cleansing happens when we allow ourselves to do something immoral because we believe we've already made enough deposits in our moral bank account that can offset those poor choices and actions and still live with ourselves. So in this way, we live without a rigid set of principles or a personal code as Luke or Lord Vader did, nor do we have the bigger vision or the magnetizing leadership style of Leia. Instead, we straddle the moral compass, sometimes doing deeds of good and other times doing deeds that are bad. We live with ourselves using rationalization that we aren't all that bad. There are far worse people in the universe today. We hope you enjoyed this bonus lesson. Reflect on your own leadership styles. Which of the characters in Star Wars do you most resonate with?